So Donald Trump and MAGA want to accuse anybody that's critical of Trump's policies of being some radical liberal whack job. And to me, this is very similar to anybody that was critical of Obama was a racist, or anybody that was critical of Joe Biden, was denying the science behind all the authoritarian lockdowns and everything that was going on. It's just dismissive. And while I do acknowledge that there's Trump derangement syndrome on the people that are on the left, there's also a lot of Trump derangement syndrome going on for his supporters. Okay? And I want to go ahead and get it out there. So, I voted for Trump in 2016. I didn't support Trump in 2020. I supported Joe Jorgensen from the Libertarian Party, which, even though she had no shot of winning, I felt like it was the principled move, so I supported Joe Jorgensen. Then in 2024, I voted for Trump again. He got me. He tricked me. I was wrong. But I'm going to admit it, and I'm going to hold him, just like during the first administration, when I was critical of Trump during the first administration, because he sold everybody on this whole America first, doing actual free market capitalist moves with the economy and with the government, and that just didn't happen. See, everybody still, and this is something on both sides. A lot of people believe that the economy was good during the first Trump administration, and that's just not accurate. It wasn't good, and all he did, he got elected into office and said everything was good, and that was it. Nothing changed. We didn't really change any of the policies. It was basically just the psychology of the reports. It was kind of like that wealth effect. The people, they believed, well, we have this free market capitalist president now, and things are going to get better. And I mean, you saw that. You saw that with the rise in stocks, which was primarily driven, by low interest rates. Even though Jerome Powell was raising interest rates, they were still relatively low historically. And see, I'll show you. Trump understands all this. See, Trump knew that the Obama revival was false. Like, it was driven by artificially low interest rates. It was driven by quantitative easing. It was driven by big government programs, the Obama stimulus bill. And so I'm going to show you this clip from the Trump-Clinton debate. And this is how Trump fooled a lot of people, especially me, into believing that he was actually going to do something different. So here's Trump back in 2016 during the debates.
We have the worst revival of an economy since the Great Depression. And believe me, we're in a bubble right now. And the only thing that looks good is the stock market. But if you raise interest rates even a little bit, that's going to come crashing down. We are in a big, fat, ugly bubble. And we better be awfully careful. And we have a Fed that's doing political things. This Janet Yellen of the Fed. The Fed is doing political by keeping the interest rates at this level. And believe me, the day Obama goes off and he leaves and he goes out to the golf course for the rest of his life to play golf, when they raise interest rates, you're going to see some very bad things happen because the Fed is not doing their job. The Fed is being more political than Secretary Clinton.
Mr. Trump.
And he was exactly right. They did start increasing the interest rates. And that's what should have happened. And what Trump should have done was say, hey, look, we're gonna have some painful times. We're gonna have a real correction in the market. And if he'd have just stayed on that instead of saying, like, boom, I'm in, everything's great. See, we never had a full-on correction in 2008 because the government intervened. That's what a lot of people just don't understand. Like, as bad as 2008 was, without the government intervention, the correction would have been much sharper and necessary, because one of the most important parts of having a capitalist system, which we do not have, but one of the most important parts of a capitalist system would be failure, which would mean banks that made bad investments need to suffer the consequences of those bad investments. Investors that trusted their money with those banks should have had to suffer the consequences. That's just the realities of the market. Now, you see, he was very critical of Yellen, saying that she was being political by keeping the interest rates low. Well, Trump, here's a CNBC article from 2018. Trump says he doesn't like what the Fed is doing. Central bank is going too fast in raising rates. See, he was saying that this is when he put Jerome Powell in. So you would think if he was critical of Yellen for keeping the rates artificially low, bringing Powell in, you want Powell to start raising rates. You want him to start normalizing rates. And what a lot of people don't understand is monetary policy takes, there's a lagging effect. It doesn't just happen immediately. So you see right here, he says, I don't want to slow it down even a little bit. He didn't want to raise them at all. He said when there's no signs of inflation. There were signs of inflation. That's what the stock market was. That's what real estate was. All of the inflation was settling in asset classes. It hadn't found its way into the consumer price markets, which happened after the CARES Act because there was so much money pushed straight into the economy while there was no offset with productive increases. So you just had this flood of money, lack of production. So that's why the consumer prices went up so fast after that. But everybody's, oh, well, the Trump tax cuts were good. Tax cuts were good. I don't have a problem with Trump's tax cuts. I'm all about tax cuts. But you have to have the spending cuts. And look, if we go right here, we have a chart. This is from the Federal Reserve Economic Data website. And I went back here so we can see what the deficits were like with when you came in from the Bush to Obama transition right here. So here's the deficits during Bush, and then bam, this is when Obama hit you with large deficits, and they basically were able to kind of like support the economy all the way through. And you see the deficits actually trending down during Obama's 2 terms. So the deficits are coming down, and then here you go. Here's Trump's first administration. The deficits start to increase. See, he gave you the tax cuts, which were good, but the spending cuts never came. Now, despite what you're going to hear from all your, the liberal friends or the people that are arguing, in the support of big government, they say, well, Trump did cut. And yes, he might have cut from certain programs, but spending increased in other areas. And that's the problem, is that Trump never cut the spending. And then look, this is, the year after the sickness, you had the CARES Act, bam, huge deficits. And then this is when Joe Biden was coming in saying, oh, well, look, I'm cutting the deficit. Yeah, because you were coming off an all-time high, like a record high. So bringing down the deficit from the record high, that's not saying much because you're still, if you went back, 10 years, you're still running historically high deficits. And that's where we're at now. Trump isn't cutting the deficit. He's pushing for lower interest rates while we're still having inflation problems. So Trump isn't this small government capitalist, person that everybody believes he is. And that's the bad thing because it makes people that are actually advocates for small government and free market capitalism, it makes us look bad. Because most people aren't going to dig into this. Most people aren't going to go read Ludwig von Mises, Murray Rothbard. They're not actually going to understand Austrian economics. You can go back and read Hayek's Road to Serfdom, and he maps out exactly why socialism and central planning will lead to exactly what we have now. It's crazy. Like the book was written, like 70 years ago. And he was able to map out exactly the path that the U.S. government has gone because he knew the problems with central planning. But this is just some of the things that Trump did that weren't good. So when you hear all these Republicans and diehard MAGA people, supporting what he did, he also implemented gun control. And people say, what? Gun control? Yeah, his ATF during his first administration banned bump stocks. Do you remember that? They said, oh, well, yeah, we have the right to come in and pass a regulation to ban bump stocks. And which, as far as I know, after the Chevron deference ruling last year, which basically limited government agencies to be able to de facto pass laws through regulation, I'm pretty sure that bump stock was overturned, but you could check on that. But anyway, so he was using executive authority to impose tariffs during his first administration. Trump loves tariffs. The only problem is the power to, basically pass tariffs lies with Congress. That's something that's in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. The president doesn't have executive authority to impose tariffs. He has no respect for the Constitution. But he's got MAGA fooled. Everybody just thinks, oh yeah, Trump's this great patriot. He is not. Using executive authority to assassinate Soleimani from the Iranian military. That's not good. That's not good foreign policy. Trump prides himself on, trying to end wars and peacefully mitigate situations. But that's not what we see. I mean, look at what's going on right now with Venezuela. We're bombing these boats. They're saying, well, they're drug dealers. You can't just execute drug dealers. We're not at war with them. And from the libertarian standpoint, if you want to end the problem with drugs, legalize them all. Make it a legal market. But this isn't even about drugs. This is about trying to destabilize Venezuela, which we've been doing for decades. Going back to when Hugo Chavez was in and George Bush Jr. was trying to get the Free Trade Areas of America Act passed, which basically was going to expand NAFTA all the way down through South America. And these are things that a lot of people just don't pay attention to. It's not about the drugs. It's about the oil that Venezuela has. They're sitting on like the largest oil reserve in the world. And Trump wants that. And not just Trump, but the big corporations want that. It's not like we're going to get that oil and then just bring it back to the United States and nationalize the sales to, provide services for the people here. That's not what it's about. And not that I even support that, but that's all it's about. And when Trump is critical, see, I'm critical of NATO. I'm critical of the United Nations. I don't think we need to be in either one of those organizations. And people will say, well, Trump's also critical of NATO. But Trump's not critical of NATO for the same reason that I am. See, I'm critical of NATO because they don't respect the sovereignty of other nations. It's an interventionist organization. It's become basically a European like a European cartel almost, especially with what's gone on between NATO and Russia post collapse of the Soviet Union. And if anybody's interested in that history, they should definitely read Provoked by Scott Horton. It's a fantastic book, outlines everything that's gone on, basically since the fall of the Berlin Wall and our expansion of NATO and how we've basically been provoking Russia into the current conflict that we're in right now. But Trump's criticism of NATO is that the other countries aren't spending enough to the defense contractors. He wants them to basically pony up. Trump's over there basically acting like the strong man for the military industrial complex, saying like, hey, you NATO countries, y'all better chip in more money. You all better give more money to the defense contractors or, we might not protect you. It's very it's a very gangster approach to foreign policy. And I tried to find this video earlier because I wanted to play it because it was I found it to be very Stalin-esque. But earlier this year when Trump, Rubio, and Hegseth went over to NATO, they did this whole, like Hollywood-style video. It was Trump and those guys getting off the airplane, walking into NATO, and they were playing that song Daddy's Home by Usher. And don't get me wrong, it was pretty funny. Like, I'm watching it, and I can't help but laugh, just the spectacle of the whole thing. But, it was very, like, cult of personality. It was, Trump and them walking to the Usher music and sitting around, and, like, they had them, like, their hair's all done real nice and shiny, and they just... if you think about it, it was really creepy. Now, I'm pretty sure Usher, whatever music company owns the rights to that song, they'd strip the rights. So, but I think you can still see the video. The audio's just been removed. But either way, it was very Stalin-esque, And, another thing that Trump did, the CARES Act right at the end of his last year. Everybody justified it because they were like, well, people shut down the economy and, what were they supposed to do? It was a bailout for big corporations. They gave some scraps to the people with these, little stimulus checks. But all in all, it was a huge bailout for corporations, especially the airlines. And I remember when I was being critical of it and people were saying, well, you got to have airplanes. Do you really think that if there wasn't a bailout for the airlines, that airplanes were just going to disappear? Do you think that's how it works? Like, if all of a sudden, like, a airline's in distress, there's not going to be any airplanes? No, it means that they were mismanaged. They, basically didn't run their industry well. And yes, you could say, well, it was the extenuating circumstances for what was going on for the disease at the time. But that's why you don't just shut everything down like that, especially when you have the hindsight of what actually happened as a result of that disease. And somebody would have came in and bought up the airline. They would have restructured it, and there might have been some layoffs, but regardless, the airlines would have survived, whether it was through the current ownership or whether it was through somebody that was going to come in and buy it up and restructure it, but there would still be airplanes. So when you heard people on the news saying like, oh, there's not going to be airplanes, that's just such an elementary, understanding of the way things work. It's not even realistic. But then after the CARES Act, this year we had the big, beautiful bill, which added to the deficit, increased the debt, and then anybody that was opposed to that, Trump's attacking. Trump's attacking Thomas Massie, who's one of our representatives here in Kentucky, and probably one of the best, representatives that I think we've had in recent decades. I say he's kind of like the new Ron Paul. I love Thomas Massie. I support him, and I'm not in his district, so unfortunately I can't vote for him, but I would definitely, advocate for him. He's the modern Ron Paul, So Trump's attacking Thomas Massie, while at the same time, more unconstitutional tariffs, that was ruled unconstitutional at the appellate court level. And if it goes to the Supreme Court and it gets overturned, because Trump doesn't have the authority to impose tariffs. Like I said, that's in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution for Congress to impose tariffs. So if the Supreme Court overturns that, then all of the tariff revenue that's been collected is going to have to get repaid back to all the importers that had to pay those tariffs. And then what's that going to do? That's an even bigger deficit. That's an even bigger deficit and more debt. But maybe even worse than the import tariffs is the fact that he forced NVIDIA and AMD to get export licenses for their chips. That's not even in the Constitution to have export licenses. And he required that a 15% share of the revenue from their export sales be given to the government. That is not capitalism. It's not even remotely close to capitalism. And they did a government buy-up of Intel. I think the government's holding like 10% of Intel stock. There's nothing in the Constitution about the government buying stock in a company. It's crazy. And as soon as he got into office, with this current administration, it was, he appointed Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, Mike Waltz, Scott Bessent, all these people that are super MAGA. They're always pointing fingers at George Soros and talking about how bad George Soros is. And I'm not a fan of George Soros, but your current Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, comes from like the Soros organization. And that does that not cause you to kind of maybe pause and think about the people that Trump's putting in? See, Trump did good. he went on Joe Rogan. He ran these podcasts. He was talking about how his first administration, he did a bad job. He was talking about John Bolton and all these other neocons that had worked their way into his administration. And he was basically, he's trying to do the, I was a political novice, and, I was fooled by some of these people in Washington. I made some bad decisions. And, after that assassination attempt on him in Pennsylvania, I was kind of like, hell, I don't know. Maybe Trump is telling the truth. Maybe he was fooled. I was trying to be optimistic, I was skeptical, but optimistic, because if what I really believe to be true, then it's over. But I can't think like that. You can't be that cynical. You have to be optimistic, because if you give up, you just give up, and then what's the point, right? Like you got to stay in it. You got to fight till the end. But I did. I was like, maybe Trump is telling the truth. I'm going to vote for him, because I was not thrilled with the libertarian pick. I think not Anthony Oliver. That's that dude that made the song Richmond and Richmond. It's like Chase Oliver or something. I don't know. He was very weak candidate. I thought a terrible choice, and I definitely wasn't going to vote for Harris. So I voted for Trump again. But he, like I said, he got me. But anyway, so like I said, I voted for Trump. As soon as he was making his next picks, I was thinking, okay, I made a mistake again. And, this is where we're at now. But the people that continue to support him, stop. He's not working in your favor. He's not on the side of the Constitution. He was using basically extortion to silence free speech on college campuses earlier this year when there were protests against Israel. Now, I don't have a problem if he wants to come in and remove all federal funding from all universities and colleges. I don't have a problem with that. I don't think that the federal government needs to be in the business of funding higher education at any or education really at any level. That should be local initiatives, state and local governments if they want to do that, but definitely not federal government, intervention into the education market. But what he was doing was saying, like, hey, basically, if if your college doesn't get in line and try to clamp down on these protests that I don't like, because this is the Republicans' cancel culture, is if you say anything condemning Israel or come out against Israel, they want to silence you. But and that's what he did. They were threatening to withhold funds based on what type of demonstrations were being allowed. That's not supporting free speech. That's not a First Amendment advocate. And then on top of that, what about the caps on the drug prices? You remember this? It was a few months ago. Trump came out and wanted to put caps on what drug companies can charge for drugs in the United States if they have a different price in other countries. Could you imagine if Joe Biden said that he was going to put a cap on the drug prices? All the Republicans would be screaming price control, socialism, blah, blah, blah. But when Trump does it, crickets, nothing. Everybody supported it. Or when they were going after U.S. aid earlier in the year, when Doge was still a thing, that whole hoax that everybody believed that we were going to have all these huge Doge cuts that never really ended up coming to fruition. But if you actually listened to what I got a clip here, listen to what Marco Rubio is actually saying about U.S. aid. He's not criticizing it for all of their coups, destabilization, and interference in foreign elections and all these other things that they've done to basically topple foreign governments. He's talking about and this is what the Democrats are mad about. See, the Democrats actually believed that USAID was some type of humanitarian organization. But if you look into USAID, it never was about humanitarianism. It was always about intervening in foreign governments and basically arm of the CIA. So listen to Rubio when he says, he's like, look, he's like, USA is not about charity. And the things that we do want it for, we're going to keep using it. Listen to what he says.
During my confirmation hearing, that every dollar we spend and every program we fund, will be aligned with the national interest of the United States. And USAID has a history of sort of ignoring that and deciding that there's somehow a global charity separate from the national interest. These are taxpayer dollars. And so I'm very troubled by these reports that they've been unwilling to cooperate with people who are asking simple questions about what is.
See, he says they think they're a global charity, you know? Clearly, they're not a global charity. And again, I'm not saying that they should have been a global charity. That's not the federal government's job is not to be a global charity. You know, so but shut USAID down. Get rid of it. Don't just cut off the parts that you don't like because you don't think they're serving like a security interest. Just get rid of the whole thing. Because our intervention in other countries is not in our security interest. And speaking of intervening in other countries, Trump wants to go back to Afghanistan. Trump wants to get back the Bagram airfield from the Taliban. Now, one of the biggest debacles during Biden's administration was the horrible pullout from Afghanistan. I'm not saying that was good, but at least we got out of there. We don't need to be in every single country around the world. We need to be an America first, American only mindset. We have to get out of this. It's not working in the best interest of its people. We're spilling our blood. We're spending our treasure. And we're doing this all at the expense of the freedoms of the future of America. So recognize Donald Trump is not a patriot. We are being sold out. America has been sold out. Hold him accountable. Call him out. Does Trump do good things sometimes? Yes. But don't let that distract you from the underlying issues that are going on. That's what they always do. Watch the left hand while the right hand continues to kill you. That's what's happening. It's no different than Biden, Obama, Bush, Clinton. They've all been doing it. We've been sold out, and it goes back earlier than them. I'm just going, this is just recent history. But seriously, stop the Trump derangement syndrome on the right. Hold him accountable and stop justifying all the unconstitutional things that he's doing just because you don't like the socialist even more. Because I'm telling you right now, if you continue to support Donald Trump, you're almost guaranteeing that we're going to have an even bigger socialist or flat out communist guy get elected. Or it might not be a guy. I've heard people talk about AOC being the Democratic nominee in 2028. Could you imagine that? AOC being the president? Or what about this Mamdani guy? Because if you keep supporting Donald Trump and saying that this is free market capitalism, which it's not, you're going to end up with a for real commie in the White House.